Sergeant First Class Ernest Kumar sat in the turret of his tank and listened to the Naktong River move in the dark. It was the last night of August 1950. His Sherman and one other tank held a stretch of riverbank near Agok, on the western edge of a shrinking pocket of ground that was all that remained of free Korea. The water in front of him was low and slow. A haze drifted off the surface. Somewhere across that river, thousands of North Korean soldiers were lowering themselves into the current. At about 10 in the evening, the fog thinned, and Kumar saw them. Enemy soldiers were crossing on a bridge built just below the surface of the water, hidden from the air, wading toward him in the dark. A voice even called out in English, claiming to be friendly South Korean police, trying to get close before the shooting started. It did not work. Kumar opened fire, and for the next several hours he fought a battle that reads like something invented. His machine guns burned through belt after belt of ammunition. When enemy soldiers pressed in against the hull, he stood upright and exposed in the open commander's hatch and worked the heavy 50 caliber machine gun by hand, sweeping them off the tank at point-blank range. He was hit in the foot by a grenade fragment and kept firing. When that gun was spent, he threw grenades, and when the attackers came closer still, he fought them with his pistol. His tank held its ground through the night, while the infantry beside him pulled back. Only after dawn did Kumar finally fight his way back toward American lines, running a gauntlet of enemy positions for miles, and destroying several of them on the way out. He had held for around 9 hours. By the most cited account, he left an estimated 250 enemy dead in the area around his tank. He was wounded and exhausted, and for that night he would receive the Medal of Honor, the highest award the United States gives for valor in combat. That single tank on that single riverbank is one small window into a much larger emergency. Behind Kumar, packed into the far southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, sat the entire surviving United Nations force in Korea, along with what was left of the Republic of Korea government. In front of them, driving hard for the sea, was a North Korean army that had not lost a battle in 2 months. If the line broke, there was no second line. There was only the ocean. Before we go further, I want to ask something small of you. This channel runs on the work of researching these stories properly and telling them in full, and the way these deep dive histories reach new people is through you. If you find this worth your time, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it. Every bit of that genuinely helps keep this work going. Now, back to the summer of 1950. In the first weeks of the Korean War, the North Korean People's Army looked unstoppable. It crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell within 3 days. Column after column of Soviet-built T-34 tanks rolled south down the peninsula's roads, and the hastily committed American units thrown in front of them were overrun again and again. By late July, the defenders had been pushed back more than 150 miles. Every attempt to hold a line had ended the same way, with the North Koreans finding a flank, breaking through, and forcing another retreat. There is a question buried inside those 2 months, and it is the question this whole story turns on. The North Koreans were winning constantly, so why did they never actually win? How did an army in full retreat, an army that had lost its capital and most of the country, suddenly stop running in one corner of the map and refuse to be pushed one step further? The answer is not a wonder weapon or a single act of genius. It is something less dramatic and, in the end, far more decisive. It is geography, exhaustion, logistics, and the stubbornness of one profane, aging general who decided that the running was going to stop whether his soldiers liked it or not. To understand how a beaten army held, you first have to understand how badly it was losing. The retreat down the peninsula had a brutal logic to it. The American troops rushed over from occupation duty in Japan were under strength, softened by garrison life, poorly equipped for armored warfare, and unprepared for the ferocity of what they met. Years of post-war budget cutting had left them short of everything that mattered against tanks. The very first American ground unit committed to Korea was a small force built around 2 rifle companies and an artillery battery, known after its commander as Task Force Smith. It dug in across the main highway north of Osan and waited. On the morning of July 5th, a column of North Korean T-34 tanks simply drove down the road and through the position. The infantry's bazooka rockets struck the tanks and bounced off the armor without stopping them. The old artillery rounds that could have punished the tanks were in desperately short supply. Within hours, Task Force Smith had been overrun and scattered, having failed even to slow the advance for long, and the survivors walked south in small groups. It was a shocking, humiliating introduction to the war. That pattern repeated across the whole of July. The 24th Infantry Division was fed into the path of the advance piece by piece, and fought a series of costly delaying actions down the peninsula, trading ground and men for time. At the city of Daejeon in the third week of July, the division made a stand and was badly mauled. In the confused street fighting, the division's own commander, Major General William Dean, personally led a team hunting enemy tanks with a bazooka, then got separated from his men during the withdrawal. He wandered the hills for weeks before being betrayed and captured, and he would spend the next 3 years as the highest-ranking American prisoner of the war. That a division commander was reduced to stalking tanks on foot and then lost entirely captures just how close to disaster those first weeks came. But delay, however costly, was doing something. Every mile the North Koreans advanced, they stretched their own supply lines a little thinner. Every bridge their engineers had to repair, every ford they had to find, every American airstrike on their trucks and rail lines in daylight. All of it slowed the machine down and bled it. The North Korean army that had crossed the parallel was not being reinforced at anything like the rate it was being worn down. Its soldiers were increasingly hungry, its tanks increasingly short of fuel and spare parts, and its ranks increasingly filled with forcibly conscripted South Koreans swept up in the occupied territory. The spearhead was still moving, but it was getting duller with every strike. Into this situation, on July 13th, arrived the commander who would define the defense. Lieutenant General Walton Harris Walker took command of the United States 8th Army in Korea. Walker was short, heavy-set, blunt, and famously hard driving. He had commanded a corps under General George Patton in the drive across France in 1944, and he had absorbed Patton's aggressive, mobile style of war. His men and the press took to calling him Bulldog Walker, and the nickname fit both his appearance and his temperament. He was not a beloved figure, he was a demanding one, and in the last week of July, with the front still collapsing, he issued the order that his name is still attached to today. The exact wording has been passed down in more than one version, because Walker delivered the substance of it verbally to his commanders around July 29, 1950, and it was reconstructed afterward. But the meaning is not in dispute. Walker told his officers that there would be no more retreating, no more readjusting the line, no more pulling back to regroup. There was, he said, no line behind them to fall back to. A retreat to Pusan, the port at their backs, would be one of the greatest butcheries in history. Everyone was to hold their ground at all costs. Units were to fight where they stood, and if they were cut off, they were to keep fighting until relieved. The order became known as the Stand or Die order. It was harsh, and some historians have argued Walker was partly trying to stiffen the spine of a frightened, exhausted force through sheer force of will. Whatever the intent, the message was received. The running was over. The ground Walker chose to make that stand on was not arbitrary. He pulled his forces back behind a natural barrier and formed what became known as the Pusan Perimeter. Picture the southeastern corner of Korea as a rough rectangle. Along the western face ran the Naktong River, a wide, meandering waterway that formed a natural moat for much of its length. Along the northern face ran a belt of steep, tangled mountains. Inside this rectangle, roughly 100 miles from top to bottom and around 50 miles across at its widest, lay the vital port of Pusan in the far corner, the temporary capital at Taegu, and the road and rail junctions that tied the whole defense together. Every soldier, every artillery shell, every gallon of fuel that reached the fight came through Pusan and moved up those interior roads and rail lines. That geography would prove to be the single most important military fact of the campaign. Here is why. When you are surrounded and pushed into a pocket, you lose almost everything, but you gain one thing. You gain interior lines. The defender inside the ring can move troops and guns from one threatened point to another across the short chord of the circle, using good roads and rail. The attacker outside the ring has to march the long way around the outside to shift his weight. Walker understood this in his bones. He had a functioning rail network inside the perimeter, he had trucks, and above all he had a road system that let him treat his scarce reserves like a bucket of water thrown on whichever fire burned hottest. The reporters covering the war gave this method a name that stuck. They called it the Fire Brigade. Facing this pocket was a North Korean force that has often been described in round numbers as 13 divisions. That figure is broadly accurate as a count of the major North Korean units committed against the perimeter over the course of the campaign, including something on the order of 10 infantry divisions and an armored division, supported by additional brigades and regiments. But the number is deeply misleading if you picture 13 full-strength divisions. By August, many of those divisions were shadows of their paper strength. Weeks of hard fighting, constant air attack, and long supply lines had hollowed them out. Some divisions that should have numbered 11 or 12,000 men were down to a few thousand effectives, many of them raw conscripts pressed into service on the march south. The North Korean army at the Naktong was still dangerous, still aggressive, and still capable of frightening local breakthroughs, but it was running on momentum and willpower, not on a deep reserve of strength. The man overseeing the North Korean war effort in the field was Kim Chek, one of the senior commanders of the invasion, working under the political direction of Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang. Their plan for the perimeter was the same plan that had worked all summer. Find a weak seam, mass what armor and infantry could still be gathered, punch through, and drive for Pusan before the Americans could build up enough strength to make the pocket unbreakable. They understood, correctly, that time was against them. Every day that passed, more American and Allied troops, more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft poured into Pusan from Japan and the United States. The North Koreans had to win quickly or they would not win at all. So in early August, they came at the perimeter almost everywhere at once. The first great crisis came on the Naktong River itself, at a place the Americans came to call the Naktong Bulge. The river makes a broad loop there, bulging westward, and inside that loop sat a jumble of steep hills. In the first week of August, the North Korean 4th Division, one of the proudest units of the invasion and a formation that had earned a battle honor for taking Seoul, crossed the river by night. Its engineers built underwater bridges, ramps of sandbags, rock, and logs sunk just below the surface, so that men and equipment could wade across on a firm footing, while the crossing stayed invisible to aircraft above. Soldiers also swam and floated their gear across on rafts. They established a bridgehead on the eastern bank and pushed inland into the positions of the American 24th Infantry Division, the same battered division that had been bled white in the July retreats. The fighting swirled across those hills for 2 weeks and had a maddening rhythm to it. American infantry, supported by tanks and heavy artillery, would fight their way onto a ridge by day, and North Korean soldiers would slip back onto it in the darkness, so the same ground had to be taken again the next morning. One hill in particular, a piece of high ground that dominated the area, changed hands repeatedly in savage close combat. Walker treated the bulge as the fire he most needed to put out, and he poured in reinforcements, including a newly arrived brigade of United States Marines and additional infantry and armor. In the middle of August, a coordinated assault, backed by massed artillery and heavy airstrikes, finally collapsed the bridgehead and drove the survivors back across the river, many of them cut down in the water as they fled. The North Korean 4th Division, once a spearhead of the entire invasion, was effectively wrecked as a fighting force. Astonishingly, the North Koreans would send fresh troops to attack the very same ground a second time in early September, and they would be beaten there again. The Marine Brigade thrown into the Naktong Bulge deserves a moment of its own, because it showed what fresh, well-trained, well-supported troops could now do. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade had arrived at Pusan in early August. and Walker used it much as he used everything else, as a mobile reserve to be rushed to the worst crisis. In the Bulge, the Marines were sent to take a long, bare ridge that the Americans nicknamed No-Name Ridge, known on the maps by the Korean name Obong-ni. The first assault up its slopes was met with heavy fire and thrown back with severe losses, a sharp reminder that even fresh units bled for this ground. But the Marines came again, this time with coordinated artillery and with Marine aircraft flown from carriers offshore, striking just ahead of the advancing infantry in close support, so tight it became a model for the rest of the war. On the second day of that fight, the ridge was taken and held, and it broke the back of the North Korean position in the Bulge. The Marines were then pulled straight out of the line and held in reserve for another emergency, because Walker never had enough troops to leave a good unit resting for long. While the Naktong Bulge burned, an even more famous fight developed to the north, on the mountain corridor that led down toward Daegu. This was the approach the North Koreans wanted most, because Daegu was the hinge of the whole perimeter and the temporary seat of the South Korean government. The main road ran through a long, straight valley, and in the third week of August, the North Koreans sent their armor and infantry straight down it in a series of night attacks. Holding the valley was the American 27th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Wolfhounds, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John McAlis. What followed was so distinctive that the soldiers gave it a name that has outlived almost every other engagement of the campaign. They called it the Bowling Alley. Night after night, North Korean tanks and self-propelled guns would grind down the straight valley road, firing as they came, with infantry pressing along the slopes on either side. Waiting for them were the Wolfhounds, dug in on the high ground, backed by American tanks, anti-tank guns, and, above all, a wall of artillery. When the enemy column came on, the defenders would let it push into the valley and then hammer it from the front and both flanks at once. The steep walls of the valley funneled and echoed the noise, the muzzle blasts, the scream of tank rounds down the corridor, the crash of shells striking armor, until the men said it sounded exactly like a bowling alley, with the enemy tanks rolling down the lane and the American fire smashing them like pins at the far end. Over roughly 5 nights in the second half of August, the North Korean armored thrust toward Daegu was broken in that valley. The road was left littered with wrecked and burning T-34s and shattered vehicles. The enemy division that had spearheaded the attack was gutted. In a telling sign of how far the North Korean army had been ground down, that division's own chief of staff crossed the lines and surrendered, and he handed over a detailed picture of units that were exhausted, hungry, stripped of experienced soldiers, and filled out with unwilling conscripts. It was hard proof that the force hammering the perimeter was running on its last reserves. Daegu, the hinge of the entire defense, held. The perimeter was never quiet in any one place for long, because the North Koreans kept probing up and down its length for the one seam that would finally give way. In the east, along the coast, the danger was just as real, and the terrain there was some of the worst on the peninsula, a maze of steep ridges and narrow valleys that favored the infiltrating attacker. North Korean units pushed down the eastern corridor toward the town of Pohang and its nearby airfield, at times threatening to roll up the entire right flank of the perimeter along the sea. Here the burden of the defense fell heavily on the soldiers of the Republic of Korea Army, fighting on their own soil for the literal survival of their country. They have too often been written out of this story, but along the mountainous eastern and northern reaches of the perimeter, South Korean divisions did an enormous share of the holding, frequently against long odds, and with far less equipment than their American allies. Backing them was one advantage the North Koreans could not answer at all along the coast. Offshore sat American and Allied warships, including cruisers and destroyers, whose heavy guns could reach far inland and smash enemy concentrations that ground troops could not touch. The fighting around Pohang surged back and forth through August. The town itself changed hands in hard combat, and at one point the situation was grave enough that a nearby airfield had to be given up and evacuated. But between the naval gunfire from the sea, the air strikes from above, and the stubbornness of the South Korean infantry, the corridor held. The eastern flank bent and bent again, but it never broke. The southern approaches told a similar story. Near the town of Masan, in the middle of August, Walker actually went over to the attack for a time, throwing a task force built around the 25th Infantry Division and the Marine Brigade westward to disrupt an enemy buildup and buy space in front of Pusan. The attack collided head-on with a North Korean offensive coming the other way, and the fighting bogged down in appalling summer heat among the southern hills, with cases of heat exhaustion rivaling combat losses. In one bitter reverse near Masan, an American artillery unit was surprised and overrun with heavy loss of life, a spot the survivors remembered by a grim nickname for the blood spilled there. The Southern Front never produced the clean breakthrough Walker had hoped for, but it never produced the enemy breakthrough Pyongyang needed either. It settled into a grinding, exhausting deadlock, which, for a defender buying time, was itself a kind of victory. Through all of this, three advantages were quietly deciding the campaign in the background, and none of them was glamorous. The first was air power. The United States Air Force, flying from bases in Japan and Korea, together with marine and naval aviation, owned the skies over the peninsula almost completely. By day, North Korean movement was a death sentence. Tanks, trucks, supply columns, and troop concentrations were hunted relentlessly. This forced the North Koreans to move and mass largely at night, which slowed everything they did and stripped away the tempo that had carried them south so quickly in July. The second advantage was logistics, and it was decisive in the most literal sense. Pusan was a genuine deep water port with real capacity, and behind it stood the industrial might of the United States and the forward supply base of occupied Japan. Reinforcements arrived on a steeply rising curve, week after week. Fresh infantry regiments and divisions, battalion after battalion of artillery, ammunition, fuel, and, critically, medium tanks came ashore in growing numbers. In the first weeks of the war, American forces had almost no armor in Korea capable of fighting the T-34 on even terms, and that gap was a large part of why July had been such a rout. That changed at Pusan. Tank battalions equipped with the M26 Pershing, mounting a 90mm gun, and with the upgunned M4 Sherman, firing a high-velocity 76mm round, were shipped in from the United States and from depots in Japan. These tanks could kill a T-34 at normal combat range, and now there were more and more of them arriving every week. By late August, the armored balance had not just narrowed, it had flipped. The North Koreans, meanwhile, were reaching the far end of a supply line that stretched hundreds of miles back across the parallel, over roads and rail that were bombed and strafed every daylight hour. Their tanks that broke down or ran dry often simply stayed where they stopped, because there was no way to recover or repair them so far forward. The third advantage was intelligence, and it mattered far more than the public understood at the time. As the campaign went on, American commanders grew steadily better at reading the strength, the positions, and even the intentions of the force in front of them. Aerial reconnaissance flew almost at will over enemy territory. The stream of prisoners and deserters swelled as the North Korean army grew hungrier and more demoralized, and many of them talked freely, revealing unit locations, strengths, and plans. Captured documents added more, and American signals intelligence could often follow enemy communications. The result was that Walker frequently had a workable picture of where the next heavy blow was likely to fall, sometimes with a day or two of warning. Combined with his interior lines, that knowledge let him take risks that would have been reckless blindly. He would deliberately strip a quiet sector down to a dangerous minimum, betting that it could hold with almost nothing, in order to concentrate a regiment, a tank battalion, or an artillery group at the point about to be struck. It was a constant, high-stakes juggling act, with never quite enough to go around. He gambled that no two crises would peak at exactly the same hour, in exactly the wrong places. Most of the time, the gamble paid, and the fire brigade reached the flames just before they spread out of control. Now and then, it was closer than any commander would want. This was generalship conducted on a knife's edge for 6 straight weeks. And the remarkable thing is not that it was sometimes nearly lost. It is that it was never quite lost at all. By the very end of August, The North Korean High Command understood that its window was closing. Every day made the perimeter stronger and their own army weaker. So they gathered themselves for one last, massive, coordinated effort to smash through before it was too late. In the first days of September, they launched what became known as the Great Naktong Offensive, striking the perimeter at multiple points simultaneously in the most dangerous single push of the entire campaign. This is the offensive that sent those infantrymen wading across the river toward Ernest Kuma's tank on the last night of August. All along the line, from the southern hills to the Naktong Bulge to the mountain approaches to Taegu and the eastern corridor, the North Koreans threw in everything they had left. For about 2 weeks in early September, the outcome genuinely hung in the balance, and this stretch was more dangerous than the whole of August that came before it. The North Koreans attacked in 5 broad thrusts at once, trying to overload the defense so that Walker could not be strong everywhere. They reopened the Naktong Bulge and had to be driven out of it a second time in fighting as vicious as the first. In the north, they seized ground on the high mountain that overlooked the approaches to Taegu, close enough that shells began to fall near the city, and for a tense few days, the South Korean government and the army headquarters made contingency plans to shift southward if the worst happened. In the east, Pohang and its sector flared up all over again. Several places along the line reported penetrations serious enough that they had to be sealed with the very last reserves on hand, sometimes with cooks, clerks, and headquarters troops thrown into the gaps. But the pattern that had held through August held one final time. No single penetration could be widened into the clean, decisive breakthrough the North Koreans needed before Walker's fire brigade arrived to wall it off, or before air power and massed artillery smothered it, or before the attacking unit simply ran out of men, ammunition, and forward momentum and stalled. The enemy divisions were now so worn down that even their successes could not be exploited. They would tear a hole and then lack the fresh troops to pour through it. The North Korean army spent the last of its strength against a perimeter that, over 6 weeks, had quietly grown far too strong and too well supplied to break. The offensive that was supposed to win the war in one blow instead consumed the last reserves of the army that launched it, and left it hollow at the exact moment it could least afford to be. And then, on September 15, 1950, the entire strategic situation was turned inside out in a single stroke, 200 miles to the north. General Douglas MacArthur, the overall United Nations commander, had spent weeks arguing for an audacious and risky amphibious landing far behind the North Korean lines, at the port of Incheon near Seoul. Many of his superiors thought the tides, the sea walls, and the narrow approaches made it nearly impossible. He insisted, and he prevailed. On September 15th, the landings went in against light opposition and succeeded brilliantly. In one move, MacArthur put a powerful force directly astride the North Korean supply lines, between the army at Pusan and its home base in the north. The effect on the perimeter was catastrophic for the North Koreans. The army battering itself against the Naktong now had an enemy corps in its rear and its lifeline cut. On September 16th, the day after Incheon, Walker's 8th Army launched its breakout from the Pusan Perimeter. The fighting was hard at first, because the North Koreans did not immediately understand how completely their position had collapsed. But within days, the front that had held for 6 weeks came apart from the inside. The North Korean army around Pusan, already hollowed out, now starved of supply and threatened from behind, broke and began to disintegrate. What had been a disciplined invasion force dissolved into columns of men trying to escape north before the trap closed. Tens of thousands were killed or captured in the pursuit that followed. The numbers tell the story of how complete the reversal was. The North Korean army that had swept south in the summer, once numbering well over 100,000 men at the height of the invasion, was effectively destroyed as an organized force in the weeks after the breakout. Only a fraction managed to escape back across the 38th parallel. The armored force that had terrorized the retreat in July, hundreds of T-34 tanks strong at the campaign's peak, had been reduced to a remnant, whittled away by better American armor, artillery, airstrikes, and simple mechanical breakdown, far from any workshop. The perimeter had not just held, It had served as the anvil against which the hammer of Incheon shattered the invading army. The human cost of those 6 weeks was severe on every side, and it is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. Tens of thousands of soldiers, American, South Korean, Allied, and North Korean, were killed or wounded in the perimeter fighting. South Korean losses, including among hastily mobilized and barely trained recruits, were especially heavy, and Korean civilians caught in the path of the fighting suffered terribly through combat, displacement, and starvation. The campaign also saw dark episodes that later investigation would document, including the massacre of American prisoners of war by North Korean troops on a hill near Waegwan in mid-August, an atrocity that hardened attitudes on the American side for the rest of the war. War on the peninsula was merciless, and the defense of Pusan was among its most merciless phases. It is also worth pausing on the people whose individual actions, added together, are what actually held that line, because a perimeter is not held by a general's order alone. Ernest Kumar, the tank commander from the opening of this story, was one of several men whose conduct during the perimeter fighting earned the Medal of Honor. Consider one more among them. On a hill during the fighting, a young infantryman found his position about to be overrun, his squad falling back around him. Rather than run, men like this fought rear-guard actions with rifle and grenade and bayonet, so their comrades could get clear, and a number of them did not survive to wear the medal they earned. The perimeter is full of such stories, most of them never written down. Machine gunners who stayed at their guns until they were killed. Forward observers who called artillery down almost on top of their own positions. Wounded men who kept loading rifles for the men still standing. The defense worked because thousands of exhausted, frightened, ordinary soldiers on ridgelines and riverbanks did not run when running would have been easy, and would have been, in the moment, entirely understandable. The line held because they chose, one position at a time, to hold it. The commanders lived out very different fates. Lieutenant General Walton Walker, the Bulldog who had willed the line into holding, did not survive the war he helped turn around. In late December 1950, during the grim retreat that followed China's entry into the conflict, Walker was killed in a jeep accident on an icy Korean road north of Seoul. He was promoted to full general posthumously, and the city of his headquarters is remembered in the name of a United States garrison in South Korea to this day. His subordinate at Incheon and his eventual successor in command, Matthew Ridgway, would go on to stabilize the front yet again in 1951. Major General William Dean, captured at Taejon before the perimeter even formed, endured 3 years of captivity and was awarded the Medal of Honor while still a prisoner, unbeknownst to him. He was released after the armistice. On the other side, the North Korean gamble at Pusan cost Pyongyang the War of 1950. The army that was supposed to reunify the peninsula by force was destroyed, and only the massive intervention of Chinese forces that autumn saved North Korea from total collapse. Kim Il-sung, whose regime had staked everything on a quick victory, would rule for more than 4 decades afterward, and the state he built endures today under his grandson. That is the thread that carries this story out of 1950 and into the present. The Korean War never formally ended. It halted in July 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty, and the two Koreas remained technically at war across one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. The front line where the fighting finally froze runs close to that original 38th parallel, not far from where the whole thing began. Tens of thousands of American troops are still stationed in South Korea, and the port and city of Pusan, now usually written Busan, is a thriving metropolis and one of the busiest container ports in the world. Its wartime role as the last lifeline of a nation largely invisible beneath the traffic and the towers. Strip the campaign down to its essence and it comes to this. An invading army that had won every battle was beaten not by a single decisive blow, but by the accumulation of things that do not photograph well. It was beaten by geography that handed the defender short interior lines and the attacker a long march. It was beaten by airplanes that made daylight movement lethal and turned a fast war into a slow one. It was beaten by a port and a supply chain that grew stronger by the day, while its own withered. It was beaten by intelligence that let a defending general see the punch coming and shift to meet it. And it was beaten by a stubborn commander who decided that the line his soldiers stood on was the last one, and by the soldiers who believed him enough to stay. The North Korean army bet that speed and shock would carry it into the sea before the defense could set. It lost that bet by about 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks, on a shrinking patch of ground in the corner of a peninsula, are the reason South Korea exists at all.